Guy de Maupassant was a French naturalist writer of short stories and novels, and is considered France's greatest short story writer. Born in 1850 to Norman parents of minor aristocracy, he received a good education and studied law in Paris, only to leave his studies for the Franco-Prussian War in 1869. After demobilization in 1871, he befriended Gustave Flaubert, who introduced him to the other great writers of the period. Both the war and the mentorship of Flaubert would provide him with the material and knowledge needed to create his greatest works of fiction. His love of expeditions into Parisian nightlife, however, led to the contraction of syphilis and led to his early death at age 43. Maupassant's characters inhabit worlds of material desires and sensual appetites in which lust, greed, and ambition are driving forces. They usually end in tragic disappointment, and some even delve into madness, crushed by a fate they dare to defy, yet still struggle against it hopelessly. The Man with the Pale Eyes by Guy de Maupassant. Monsieur Pierre Agénor de Varnier, the examining magistrate, was the exact opposite of a practical joker. He was dignity, staidness, correctness personified. As a sedate man, he was quite incapable of being guilty, even in his dreams of anything resembling a practical joke, however remotely. I know nobody to whom he could be compared, unless it be the present President of the French Republic. I think it is useless to carry the analogy any further, and having said thus much, it will be easily understood that a cold shiver passed through me when Monsieur Pierre Agénor de Varnier did me the honor of sending a lady to wait on me. About 8 o'clock, one morning last winter, as he was leaving the house to go to the Palais de Justice, his footman handed him a card, on which was printed, Dr. James Ferdinand, member of the Academy of Medicine, Port-au-Prince, Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. At the bottom of the card there was written in pencil, From Lady Frogère. Monsieur de Varnier knew the lady very well, who was a very agreeable Creole from Haiti, and whom he had met in many drawing rooms, and on the other hand, though the doctor's name did not awaken any recollections in him, his quality and titles alone required that he should grant him an interview, however short it might be. Therefore, although he was in a hurry to get out, Monsieur de Varnier told the footman to show in his early visitor, but to tell him beforehand that his master was much pressed for time, as he had to go to the law courts. When the doctor came in spite of his usual imperturbability, he could not restrain a movement of surprise, for the doctor presented that strange anomaly of being a Negro of the purest, blackest type, with the eyes of a white man, of a man from the north, pale, cold, clear blue eyes, and his surprise increased when, after a few words of excuse for his untimely visit, he added with an enigmatical smile, "My eyes surprise you, do they not? I was sure that they would, and to tell you the truth, I came here in order that you might look at them well and never forget them." His smile and his words, even more than his smile, seemed to be those of a madman. He spoke very softly, with that childish lisping voice which is peculiar, and his mysterious, almost menacing words consequently sounded all the more as if they were uttered at random by a man bereft of his reason. But his looks, those looks of those pale, cold, clear blue eyes, were certainly not those of a madman. They clearly expressed menace. Yes, menace, as well as irony, and above all the implacable ferocity, and their glance was like a flash of lightning which one could never forget. "I have seen," Monsieur de Varnier used to say when speaking about it, "the looks of many murderers, but in none of them have I ever observed such a depth of crime and of impudent security in crime." And this impression was so strong that Monsieur de Varnier thought that it was a sport of some hallucination, especially as when he spoke about his eyes, the doctor continued with a smile, and in his most childish accents, "Of course, monsieur, you cannot understand what I am saying to you, and I must beg your pardon for it. Tomorrow you'll receive a letter which will explain it all to you. But first of all, it was necessary that I should let you have a good, careful look at my eyes which are myself, my only and true self, as you will see." With these words and with a polite bow, the doctor went out, leaving Monsieur de Varnier extremely surprised, and a prey to this doubt as he said to himself, "Is he merely a madman? The fierce expression and the criminal depths of his looks are perhaps caused merely by the extraordinary contrast between his fierce looks and his pale eyes." And absorbed in these thoughts, Monsieur de Varnier unfortunately allowed several minutes to elapse, And then he thought to himself suddenly, "No, I am not the sport of any hallucination, and this is no case of an optical phenomenon. This man is evidently some terrible criminal, and I've altogether failed in my duty in not arresting him myself at once, illegally, even at the risk of my life." The judge ran downstairs in pursuit of the doctor, but it was too late. He'd disappeared. In the afternoon, he called on Madame Frogère to ask whether she could tell him anything about the matter. She, however, did not know the Negro doctor in the least, and was even able to assure him that he was a fictitious personage, for as she was well acquainted with the upper classes in Haiti, she knew that the Academy of Medicine at Port-au-Prince had no doctor of that name among its members. As Monsieur Duvarney persisted and gave descriptions of the doctor, especially mentioning his extraordinary eyes, Madame Frogère began to laugh and said, "You have certainly had to do with a hoaxer, my dear monsieur. The eyes which you've described are certainly those of a white man, and the individual must have been painted." On thinking it over, Monsieur Duvarney remembered that the doctor had nothing of the Negro about him but his black skin, his hair and his beard and his way of speaking, which was easily imitated, but nothing of the person, not even the characteristic undulating walk. Perhaps, after all, he was only a practical joker, and during the whole day Monsieur Duvarney took refuge in that view, which rather wounded his dignity as a man of consequence, but which appeased his scruples as a magistrate. The next day he received the promised letter, which was written, as well as addressed in letters cut out of the newspapers. It was followed. "Monsieur, Dr. James Ferdinand does not exist, but the man whose eyes you saw does, and you will certainly recognize his eyes. This man has committed 2 crimes for which he does not feel any remorse. But as he is a psychologist, he's afraid of someday yielding to the irresistible temptation of confessing his crimes. You know better than anyone, and that is your most powerful aid, with what imperious force criminals, especially intellectual ones, feel this temptation. That great poet, Edgar Poe, has written masterpieces on this subject, which express the truth exactly. But he has omitted to mention the last phenomenon, which I will tell you. Yes, I, a criminal, feel a terrible wish for somebody to know of my crimes, and when this requirement is satisfied, my secret has been revealed to a confidant, I shall be tranquil for the future, and be freed from this demon of perversity which only tempts us once. Well, now that is accomplished. You shall have my secret. From the day that you recognize me by my eyes, you will try and find out what I am guilty of, and how I was guilty, and you will discover it, being a master of your profession, which by the by has procured you the honor of having been chosen by me to bear the weight of this secret, which now is shared by us, and by us two alone. I say advisedly by us two alone. You could not, as a matter of fact, prove the reality of this secret to anyone, unless I were to confess it, and I defy you to obtain my public confession, if I confessed it to you, and without danger to myself. 3 months later, Monsieur Duvarney met Monsieur X at an evening party, and at first sight and without the slightest hesitation, he recognized in him those very pale, very cold, and very clear blue eyes which it was impossible to forget. The man himself remained perfectly impassive, so that Monsieur Duvarney was forced to say to himself, "Probably I'm the sport of a hallucination at this moment, or else there are 2 pairs of eyes that are perfectly similar in the world. And what eyes? Can it be possible?" The magistrate instituted inquiries into his life, and he discovered this, which removed his doubts. 5 years previously, Monsieur X had been a very poor but very brilliant medical student, who, although he never took his doctor's degree, had already made himself remarkable by his microbiological researches. A young and very rich widow had fallen in love with him and married him. She had 1 child by her first marriage, and in the space of 6 months, first the child and then the mother died of typhoid fever, and thus Monsieur X had inherited a large fortune in due form, and without any possible dispute. Everybody said that he had attended to the 2 patients with the utmost devotion. Now, were these 2 deaths the 2 crimes mentioned in his letter? But then Monsieur X must have poisoned his 2 victims with the microbes of typhoid fever, which he had skillfully cultivated in them so as to make the disease incurable, even by the most devoted care and attention. Why not? "Do you believe it?" I asked Monsieur Duvarney. "Absolutely," he replied, "and the most terrible thing about it is that the villain is right when he defies me to force him to confess his crime publicly, for I see no means of obtaining a confession, none whatever. For a moment I thought of magnetism, but who could magnetize that man with those pale, cold, bright eyes? With such eyes, he would force the magnetizer to denounce himself as the culprit." And then he said with a deep sigh, "Formerly there was something good about justice." and when he saw my inquiring looks, he added in a firm and perfectly convinced voice, "Formerly, justice had torture at its command." "Upon my word," I replied, and with all authors conscious of simple egotism, "it is quite certain that without the torture, this strange tale would have no conclusion, and that that's very unfortunate, as far as regards the story I intended to make out of it."